Hello, and welcome to Wix's library. The following sample is from my new audiobook, WitchBlood, available on Audible, iTunes, and Amazon. I hope you enjoy. WitchBlood, Volume 1, by Wix Solis. Narrated by Wix Solis. Dedication. For Kirsty, who'll always be more than a muse, her Sophia like fire helped warm my desire to finish this book. Chapter 1. A Witch's Desperation. No, it's not possible. Thoughts of how fucked she was drowned her mind. Why did she feel this way? Limited, less, foggy, fucked. Where was Quirth? Everyone warned her against choosing such a dark creature as a familiar, and while she would remind him of that a great deal, she never revealed to him that he had never truly failed her, not when it mattered. Never. Until now. Now thoughts of regret broke her pride. Shock stumbled her as she realised she didn't miss his skills but him, the little twat he was. The space she was in was large, alas a single room, no separating walls. Rusty beds without mattresses, one window and not much else. She floundered over to her old bed, the one closest to the window. She rubbed its frame, specifically over the scratches her past self had made, a tally. It made her notice herself. She looked down at her hands, naked of ring and trinket, all relics and help absent from her wrists. With the panic ball film of sweat upon her dark skin thickening, she made the book summoning symbols, with both hands forming fists, but one hand forming a fist with index finger outstretched, and the other fist 3 fingers outstretched. As she brought hands together and muttered the secret word she had anchored as the magical key, nothing happened. She tried again. However, the book didn't open itself into existence. Bewildered, her eyes remained where it should be levitating but wasn't. Her panic gave birth to desperation, which she felt as deep as her bones. Okay, what's going on? I thought... Her out-loud self-defiance was interrupted by a boom beyond thunder. The unearthly sound was born from an unknown force hitting the whole left side of the building. So hungry a force, the window in its frame shattered, spitting out its vitreous teeth onto the stone floor. Thoughts that the building was collapsing consumed her, but it didn't. As she opened her eyes, she saw the door had splintered but still held, though only unbroken due to the sigil it wore. However, now the blood which made the paint had a much deeper root. Sophia could see it was one of her own design, one of the first blood sigils she had ever learned, a simple but powerful non-entry spell. Its glow now dim, it remained active but was fading. Her head spun with pain as she tried with all her might to remember making it. She couldn't. She could barely picture the moment before, and had no more time as the imminent future demanded her mind's presence. She threw off her concerns. The tiny truth she held on to was that her little shield was keeping the awful dark out there, and this pleased her. It gave her just enough time to make a choice. But what was she fighting? And she thought she knew but couldn't remember. And why was she fighting? And why alone? None of it mattered. She wiped her fear from her face and got ready for war. Her mind spoke to her. Time to be smart, not scared. With this new ice in her veins, she coaxed herself to fall onto her knees. Her plan was desperate, but desperation was something known all too well. She knew it was on the verge of impossible, almost lunacy, but she hated the helplessness imposed on her, and it seemed better than the guaranteed prey she was. Orphan Mother Privy's voice sung in her head, one of her slogans spoken so many times she saw it as part of her rather than a mantra. If you listen, the world will whisper to you what you can and cannot do. It gave her idea an idea. Her plan would fail if her body was frozen, so she couldn't rush it. The panic would use more of her energy and the final remnants come the end will be needed. It had to be done another way. Mind state always influenced action. And she was trying to stop the sea for a moment, about to ask the sky to open just for her. It had to be done right. Her breathing had quietened, and whilst not smiling, her face was no longer tight. Whilst not relaxed, she cared less than she did. She almost jumped to her feet. Walking over to the shards of glass on the floor, she scooped one up, and then thought to herself a final time about how crazy she was. It's going to take almost every drop I have, and I've only seen it done once. No room for error, but what do you expect? She cut her wrist deeply with the cabin's tooth. Though so used to incision with her whole body covered in scars, this felt different. She drew a little blood for a little help. She was a blood witch. But this was mutilation. This did not stop her, but was seen as the extra cost for what she wanted. As she drew the large circle from the stream that fell from her, she felt her energy leave her as if a river, but she could not stop. Instead, she closed her eyes and pictured the orphanage garden. She saw all the trees moving in unison, breathing and dancing lives in their own respect. As she went on to breathe in and out, she saw within herself. She saw her lungs as these trees, her leaves the alveoli, the whole garden, the whole world inside her chest helping her breathe and keeping her calm. This introspective echo she held onto tightly as she felt her hands speed up with the patterns they were drawing within the circle. Solomon squares, alchemy crossovers, and even the ancient projected forms. Everything she found difficult done as if simple. All of Sophia's resistance eroded away, but so was every other part of her, and if she failed, any remnants of this resistance left behind were worthless to her. Again, it did not matter now. Her attempt was nearly done. Then she would either have the power she needed, or at least be allowed to give in to the creeping weight of slumber saturating her. She had no more life in her. She fell, using her last choice to throw her hand towards the activating circle at the top of her design rather than kneel or break her fall. As her body lay, the sigil set a light brighter than the sky above. It shone in defiance, dwarfing the sky's fury. The flame the blood had become burned a wondersome white and red with silver flicking in its core. Then all the scratches and shapes inside the circle slivered to the outside, thickening the sigil's perimeter until the flaming circle surrounding Sophia was empty but for her. Then, as if an atmospheric pressure was abounding, the fire blood took accelerated return to her veins, filling her with magic flame. She breathed in strongly, though she had been wasting her lungs till now, and then rose to her feet, then levitated off the ground. Godhood was in her veins, but for how long? She felt it burning her away, but she had more than she needed, more than enough power. She could do anything. She had to calm herself for a new reason. She was getting drunk on possibility. The problem above her in comparison to before was nothingness, ant-sized. Now she had new choices to make. However, before she could act, the room began to melt away. Then, when surrounded by nothing but blackness, she allowed herself to also be enveloped, to melt away too. And closing her eyes, everything went black. Chapter 2. The Master's Meeting. Arthur felt small. Disgrace to be the reason his pupil was being whipped up into a self-concocted fear. For no other reason than to have knowledge of her, and over her. All the masters were agreed. To lie to their students and hope their dreams fade away. As common with the Dreamtime ritual. To be part of that, part of a group thirstily watching an unconscious girl laid upon an ancient mirrored floor, blasé about discussing her private dreams as she fights them. Regardless of the encroaching threat, it was wrong to him. But he was outvoted, as always. He was from a time before most of theirs, before this one. If it was his choice, he would have been left behind. Warriors don't want to be old, especially over 200 years. The other masters back and forths were murmurous to him as he pondered, so he let his mind wander further. Maybe it was because his eyes already wore guilt, but he saw her as a girl and not his disciple. Always so fierce and fiery, her intentful, forceful motions gone. No hair, hat or hand covering her face. Her shoulder-length black hair currently in pigtails. If he looked at her sleeping form and not past her to what she was doing in the mirror, he saw how sweetly round her cheeks were, how buttoned her nose, how well suited her eyebrows were, bushy but perfect for non-verbal communication. The girl's shoulders sloped down, so quite wide but deceivingly so. She was athletically slender. Arthur believed her form's acquisition obvious with her forehead bearing many unrelated to magic marks. He looked further, saw how the scars of her face were few and shallow but the two on her neck deep, and the deepest being upon her chest, with even more upon her wrists and hands. He wondered what the pattern of scars looked like under her clothes, but it was platonic, more to the end of knowing if in selective clothes she may look unblemished, if she could hide in a quiet life. She was attractive, but he was so past carnal relations. Even in his first life he swore off women to focus on becoming a great force for good. Come this second life forced upon him, he didn't even remember what those inclinations felt like. The recoils of his former life also wore at him physically. As he clutched the stump of his right elbow, he wondered if the phantom burning of his arm was something poignant to these thoughts, or if he had been so deep in himself he hadn't noticed the pain. Regardless, he gently rubbed it in a slow, soothing manner, like how a man twiddled his beard when chewing on his thoughts. The change in stance was enough for the other masters to notice his absence in their conversation, with the bearded pirate and behemoth of a man directly opposite Arthur beginning the parade of comments.
"You ain't said nuttin', One Arm.
You see what your crazy bitch is trying to do? Zaros proclaimed.
It is a forbidden ritual she shouldn't know about, Arthur, said softly the woman aside Zaros.
As she spoke, her eyes swiftly flicked up off the mirrored floor to try and meet Arthur's eyes, then back to it. They cared not to have failed. They let him know she was onto his potential miscreants. He did not care.
Those green eyes and green skin, they match our green as grass naivety.
Whilst he ignored her with his gaze remaining transfixed upon Sophia, Arthur did raise his eyes a few heartbeats later to look up at Yenya, whom he knew was also going to speak. His eyebrows had raised involuntarily but slightly. They had made his face disregarding.
She's going to succeed,
Yenya whispered, though his voice still cut the room with its depth. His familiar, currently in the form of a lark, returning to his shoulder as if to grow his aura of dominion. The bird's eyes never left Arthur as it landed, but Yenya's never left the mirror.
Fuck off, if she can do that there, it's confirmed, let's just...
Zaro began bellowing. Spit spluttered from his lips down his black and grey beard, though he cut his own proclamation short as he had noticed Yenya had started to move around the sleeping girl and towards him. Though his eyes were kept down, watching Sophia's dream, the circle of blood around her was now alight, confirming Yenya's suspicions.
You're making me think your heart still wants to negotiate with the threat,
Yenya said as he reached Zaros, putting his hand gently on his shoulder. Zaros was far bigger than Yenya, and his thick muscles tightened at the contact. His teeth gritted with such strength they looked liable to shatter in his mouth. But he had heard the stories told world over, and his eyes had seen Yenya complete feats beyond him there in themselves. No man could dominate him, but the council head was more than a man. So the Pirate King did what came hardest to him. He surrendered.
We need to end this,
Cassandra demanded. As she spoke, she walked over to and behind Zaros, who huffed in accordance, her closeness jolting his mind back into the room, his shoulder shunting Yenya's hand from his by aggressive jerk. Arthur's eyes greedily gulped in the scene. Even the threat of violence had conflict, and this thrilled him. The opposition of the two men had Arthur think on his own aging form. Inspecting Yenya, he saw how only Zaros could dwarf him. He was still so tall. Unlike his own tatty attire, his friend wore clothes 100 years more modern. Brown one-coloured leather, long with many pockets. Sophia often said that he himself had a grandfatherly face, whereas Yenya he knew was desired by many women, all his junior. It was plain why. His skin was aged, but the wrinkles few and shallow, his hair more silver than white, still pristine and thick. The way it was longer on one side was almost vampiric, the longer side often a flap overhanging to cover a side of his forehead and upper face. Women loved the peacocking, the old man thought. Whereas his own face he barely recognized when he saw it gulping back from the mirrored floor. So many wrinkles that he himself found impossible to distinguish, to tell if they were new furrow or antiqued scar. Arthur touched his bulbous nose and ruminated on its old shape. His friend's nose was large from age too, but not wide. It was longer and more sloped, distinguished. His shoulders were not wide, but not many would know from how he used his height. His beard was greyer than the molten silver of his hair, more like stone, and perkily kept in an inverted triangle that entirely covered his mouth. He did not want anyone to know his speech's whats and whens, or even witness its micro-expressions. Arthur was confident he could read him regardless. The Master of the Moon and Sun's ears were smaller than his own, medium-sized and pinned back. This, along with his nose, gave an Avarian and predatory energy to his presence, like he was thousands of yards above us all. Scratching his own head in a comforting assessment, the difference between him and his friend further burned at him. The elder man still had hair, but not a lot, so he kept it buzzed, his wide ears no longer able to be hidden by said hair. His looks went a long, long time ago. Now people looked at him like he never was young. His barrel head no longer the sign of a warrior, but now a fool. Arthur felt the twinge as he kept both his eyes open. Both worked, but two intersecting scars from different battles traced across his left eye. As often, relenting, he began squinting with it. He continued watching, knowing irrespective of if it was going to explode or subside, that moment was now. Yenya ignored the aggressive slight, knowing Zaros's inclination for impulsive action could slow down the day. However, he finally looked up from the mirror, his gaze speedily meeting Zaros before being held on Arthur.
I can smell your curiosity, my apathetic friend, I share it. But we don't know enough, Arthur. What if it's the final wear and tear needed? You know we're not ready.
One wrong step now will crush us. Warmth accompanied the inherent dominance in his tone this time. With all three masters now on the opposite side of the sleeping girl and to Arthur, his reply came without warmth, instead his usual cadence, slowly spoken but well enunciated. Fine, but know your disciples are no different. Think on your own, youths. The only thing we've learned from all these dreams is now we know my students on a higher level than Zaros's creepy twins, Cassie's wimpy siblings, or even your cherished sun and moon. His accompanying gesture even closer matched the content of his words than his tone, as he straightened his only arm and defiantly swept over Sophia's head as if he held a ceremonial sword. Coinciding was muttering something known only to him. The mirror gradually faded black, then sharply inverted to its reflective form. Albeit to different levels, all three masters took displeasure with these words, with halted hisses, snarls, and more all coming from the unlikely pack. All further words were held for now, however, as Sophia had begun to come to, and appearances around the young were oh so important in their upholding. The four masters studied the girl eagerly to see if she would remember the ordeal. Sophia's face was crunched up with the transitional tension. Her eyes opened. Both the blue one and the red one were filled with deranged glee from the situation before, then confusion, then pain. She closed her eyes tightly to deal with it. Then her eyelids softened, her face relaxed, and she opened them lightly, this time herself. The girl shot up into a sitting position whilst equipping her secret bone knife bracelet, but she realised her surroundings before any incision or incantation were begun. Zaros couldn't help but smile at the girl's reflex to fight. Approaching the girl wearing a steely smile, the Pirate King offered his hand out, declaring,
Fuck the blood magic, join me, my child. I have chaos items that would spin your head.
His voice playful. Sophia was cycling her gaze between his black eyes and offered gold-drenched hand. Her lip was upturned ever so, unnoticed by Zaros. This may as well have been a grimace to Arthur, who knew she didn't enjoy being called child, and had not really considered his offer yet. Arthur did not want her considering the offer. He knew his student was a good person, but he equally knew she was quick to anger, with this intoxicating her mind in so many situations. Not having moved, he was already standing by the girl but to her back. He loudly followed Zaros, making the girl spin around sharply to see his only hand also being offered to help her up. She's a blood witch, and I don't think she's looking for a king to protect. Arthur's reply was cunning and his tone matching. The girl looked atop her shoulder, back at Zaros, who had said no more, hand still out, smile widening. Then past him, Cassandra and Yenya were standing by the door, Cassandra quietly berating the council's head. When Cassandra saw Sophia was looking, she stopped her frantic verbal whispers, opened the door whilst holding eye contact with her, then left the room. At the loud shutting of the heavy metal door, Zaros's hand dropped and he swung his enormous body around. Seeing Cassandra had left, he strode across the mirrored floor towards the door himself, rushed but not panicked. His steps made a twanged ping as they hit the floor with force. He shouted back as he moved.
Open offer!
This was trailed by roaring laughter.
Asshole,
Arthur grumbled. A chuckle came from the girl as she spun her head back round and grabbed his hand in one swift motion. Now back in her swing, she easily shot herself up into her feet. She was small, so when she pulled herself up, Arthur was more than enough of an anchor, not moving despite being so much less than he used to be. Yenya had walked over to Arthur, bumping into him playfully as he reached him. Though now all standing, Yenya had to look down at his elderly friend and the tired witch. With a well-practiced smile, he made attempt to comfort the girl.
Well done today. You surprised us, if not your master. Now run along and get some sleep, or gossip if you prefer. But real explanations come tomorrow.
A wink accompanied the suggestion. Arthur winced inside like the eye shot an arrow. The words were not just for her, but his friend's subtle way of telling him he's disappointed for the missing honesty between them. Alas, Yenya was too logical, and Arthur didn't want him calculating just yet. The one-armed warlock usually enjoyed when the celestial master had subtle coherences hidden just for him in words spoken for others, but not today. Arthur made great effort to hold face and not drop his head.
Thank you, Yenya,
Sophia's awkward words were complemented by a toothless smile. She, like everyone, had great reverence for Yenya, seeing him as more legend than man. Not many people could shake Sophia's conviction, and Arthur wondered if she would hold him as highly in her mind's eye if she knew as much about Yenya as he did. It's not that he didn't respect his friend, but was more than aware of his mortal imperfections. Sophia's quizzled expression showed she was still thinking how best to respond, but Yenya took the pause as a chance to halt the stumbling and announce his departure.
I have business to attend to before my bird flips, as I like to say. Regardless, I'm sure you both have thoughts to barter. Always best done in private.
His words came with a chortle. With this, he gracefully moved towards the door, as quickly as Zaros, but without the accompanying cacophony. As he left, he sent Arthur a telepathic message. This was rare for several reasons.
I'm no Bentham, but you can't deny the similarity between the situations. Remember your obligatory master.
The foreign thought echoed unpleasantly in Arthur's mind, quieter each time until it dispersed. Before he reached the door, he began murmured incantations to himself. They were too quiet to discern properly, yet in the strange silence ambient to this room they were loud enough for Sophia to hear. They sounded like Egyptian sun magic, ending as he reached the exit, which opened itself, but not to reveal the long many-doored corridor to the water hall, but instead a portal. Creating a portal was very difficult magic. Sophia loved staring into them, like monks who lose themselves in the plasmic dances of flames. They seemed to have a thin layer of liquid covering them, the tear between here and wherever they were going. You could never quite see through because of this distorted stratum. It moved akin to rocks hitting water, with occasional crackles of black lightning that would change the pattern of these ripples. It was all stages of matter, but none of them. Regardless of what type of magic created them, or where they were going, all portals Sophia had seen had looked the same. Yenya stepped through the translucent, watery electric threshold, vanishing except for Sarge. A few seconds afterwards, the edges of the portal came together rapidly, closing itself so fast that the afterimage of dark ball lightning remained in the doorway, but this too was quickly gone. The door slammed, and once again the room was slumberous.
That isn't quite what you fucking said would happen, Master.
Sophia stretched out the words in cocky disapproval.
I know. In my defense, now I can tell you I voted against testing you.
Arthur relented with a softened voice.
Weird test. All I can remember is that the dream was draining me, and then... What actually happened?
Sophia cut her own searchings short, demanding come sentence end.
I already tell you too much, but what happened, Sophia, is that you were purposefully scared and cornered, and so you performed a spell that you shouldn't know, a spell that, as far as I'm aware, I haven't taught you, a dangerous spell not found in my library, but hiding in my diary.
Arthur smoked melodically, as to add a touch of joviality to the chastisement.
Why do you even scribble in that thing? The whole point of your grimoire is that it can't be read by others. It was the first thing you taught me. I shouldn't have even been able to...
The girl stopped herself, though Arthur didn't need the pause to be given.
Not your business, my student. Anyway, one should fully understand the forces they wield before they risk their lives to wield them. Not many are even worthy of that.
Touching the nerve burnt up the remnants of guilt within him. His teacher's mask had now fully returned. Sophia looked down shameful from the snap, but only for half a heartbeat. Predator she was, her eyes raised back up. She would not hold her tongue.
Did the other masters lie to their students too?
She got brave, adding condescension to the tone.
I'm not sure. Did the other students steal from their masters?
He asked flatly. There was no fun left in him. The girl broke.
Okay, I'm sorry. Shit, it wasn't even like that. I jokingly mumbled that I need to know more about your diary to myself, but Quirf heard and sensed how much I wanted it. He shot off and... I am sorry, though.
Many people would look away after an apology, but as vulnerable as she felt, Sophia held eye contact with Arthur. The man puckered his lips and lowered his brow as if to say, "What have I told you about that creature?" But then his face changed, dropping the expression. He looked at the ground and smiled ever so. Sophia gave a sigh of relief. No grand reprisal was upon her. Continued tutelage meant any kind of punishment did not matter. More so, she believed her master saw the humour in the event. However, Arthur's smile was birthed from his own relief, something not often saw by his disciple of 15 months, and so unrecognised. Relief that she hadn't entirely chosen to invade his privacy. She hadn't read it all, and thankfully did not realise the reason why it had to exist.
Come on, I hate this room.
As he spoke, Arthur gestured his only hand into a thumb pointing over shoulder towards the door. She nodded in understanding. They walked towards the door next to each other. The man's age slowed him, but he moved proudly, intentful larger striding steps making up for this.
She moved in short, light-footed steps, many a time. Though smaller, she could easily outmaneuver him. Arthur was more than aware of their differences, and he liked that his pace made her slow from hers. Before they reached the door, he subtly nodded towards it. She took off like rabbit. Reaching it was many times her size. She had to grasp a handle with both hands to pull the great door to. It swung inward, taking her with it. Arthur passed her straight-faced, though he did find it amusing. Entering the great corridor, he noticed it had turned rose red, which he did not like. It was so rare for it to be opaque in its colour. But he let it leave his mind promptly. Even with such a long corridor, he didn't want to squander time. There was no room for fleeting fancy and mild concerns. Bigger things were afoot. Sophia had rapidly caught up with Arthur, though she hadn't returned to his side but trailed behind him. She couldn't help but have her focus shift to the walls of the many-doored corridor. It was always a mixture of colours, or at least a weird shade, but currently the brightest red. She swore it could almost talk, so what was it saying today? Strangely, it made her think of anger. She retook her mind and pushed the ponder back to common thoughts about the doors she wasn't allowed behind. There was just so many interesting doors. 100, and she had only seen behind a dozen of them. If she could choose only one more to explore, she would struggle. Would it be the beautiful golden jewel-encrusted door? Or the greenish hairy door? It had so many locks on it. She had never even seen a master glance at it. Thinking of masters, her own returned to her mind. From behind, she saw his hand tighten around his belt as he walked. A habitual thing, she thought. His belt around his guard could without blood magic become a rigid walking stick, but this was rare and only seen by Sophia and Yenya, briefly after waking up from sleep. She reflected on how he hated his age. Many of his gowns even hung so low they covered his feet. One never knew which way they were facing or how poised he was. She heard the non-verbal intonations that meant he was about to speak and began to worry he would notice her only half paying attention. So she paid no further mind to it all. It wasn't her time yet. Thus she returned to attentive student mode, giving a double skip to catch up, reaching his side as he began to speak.
Do you remember your first magic theory lessons? Explaining that we resonate with different schools depending on what symbols and icons we were raised with. That your subconscious and shadow side, they grip onto these. This and more is what influences you when you translate the unseen forces you wield. Manipulating reality takes more than manipulating your outer form.
He spoke with strange tonal changes. He was in teacher mode.
Yeah, if I liked singing or moving my ass around instead of art and shit, I wouldn't have been a blood witch. And any person wielding any type of magic can become a great force if they understand themselves.
Her response nonchalant but proud. Sophia, though silent, thought more on her first choice. She liked that if magic was going to have a cost, that she could avoid the abstract nature of it with blood. It's a direct trade. It's simple. This mathematical-like quality appealed to her in her way of calculating life, though only the mirror's reflection of the cost was known to her then and now.
Well, I lied. Magic is complicated, and that book learning refers to the norm. For example, I did not choose the school of blood. I did not even pursue magic. For another, some people have a far more powerful connection with magic than others and can wield multiple magics like Yenya. These people shape the world. Things I've downplayed to you mean a lot more than I let on. Being a student to a master and not a book means that you have more than my spells. You have my quirks, my secrets, or will.
Arthur was rambling, his teacher's mask slipping.
Okay.
Sophia's perplexity twisted her face as well as her words.
I'm part of your magic more than you realize. What I'm trying to say, girl, is no matter where your future takes you, a little version of me is with you.
Arthur used his kindest voice, though it was rusty.
Oh, I see. But what's going on? Are you going somewhere? You're rarely soppy. Everyone's being odd and I got a bad feeling now.
Sophia's increasing tempo and slowing pace indicated she was starting to worry. So used to being interrupted by her master, now she ceased when he spoke. His consoling was accompanied by giving her awkward pats on the back.
Don't sweat, I'll clarify, then you worry. It looks like the school will be disbanded, and more than that, things are going to change. For the worse.
Arthur looked away from her before releasing the last of these words.
Shit, when? Do I go? Do I get to go with you?
The witch's tempo grew even more.
I know I'm burdening you with a lot, but we will discuss everything tomorrow. Go talk to your friends about their dream trials and don't tell anyone about what we've spoken about.
With this, he slowed his own pace and looked intensely into her heterochromatic eyes, but as he finished, his head turned straight again. She had been looking back into his old grey eyes so hard, trying to affect him, she hadn't noticed that they were coming to the end of the corridor. The giant door was already open, so she looked ahead to and through the silvery sandstone archway to try and see the other students. She couldn't yet. They will be standing around the fountain talking, which was common, though the extra energy was palpable everywhere. Arthur once again nodded his head to direct her, though now it was encouraging. She left lingering and bedazzled, not her usual pace. Arthur used sad eyes to watch her trudge away. Her head spun around before reaching the archway, looking back as if to say, "I still think you're hiding something." Arthur felt the message in her gaze and turned around, walking back up the corridor. Towards his home away from home, the celestial door. He felt bad lying to her about so much and more. He did not know if it was this guilt, the similarity of the approaching, Yenya's obvious words or the girl's devoted eyes. For whatever reason, he found himself rubbing his right arm stump again, but this time thinking back further. To all those years ago when the man he was had this life forced upon him. To the last time a witch was sacrificed. Chapter 3. Deathly Dawdle. Flashback. His body was so fast back then and magic barely a concern. At least not an internal one. To the table's finest knight, if anything, it was distasteful, and went against God's design. Even the nature magic of the field workers thorned his mind when he ate their produce. Though bigger, he was a smaller man then, never seeing the bigger picture, or how each of his choices was a brushstroke painting more than just his future. He relished in success, and regardless, what was a greater goal to pursue than vanquishing the realm's biggest threats? His sword hung heavy in his hand, burning his bicep. He refused to have it enchanted. He missed that sword, even though it would be useless to the man the centuries had made him. He struggled to remove dented helm. Though his head no longer rang, he still tasted blood. He had since the last battle. It did not matter. The campaign was nearing end anyway. He took deep unobstructed breath to cool himself, summoned and spat the filth from his mouth. Looking up at the strange sky, he knew this was the spot. Funny how he couldn't remember the landscape entirely, just the poignant. Black trees surrounded by their dead leaves, and a small hill yonder where sky-fallen lights were hitting sporadically. The knight chuckled at the ease of it. He was great with directions, though the origin of dark magic was always atop a hill and hellish creatures always below. As his view fell back down, it was drawn to the obligatory dark guards. Yet this time was different. His focus was sharper than usual and his gut rumbled dread. It had been a year or so since he had tasted fear, but that always went in hand with the unexpected. And this was unexpected. Odd even on a quest like this. They wore no armour, showing off unnaturally toned muscles on disproportionate forms. They were pink, but with such a strange hue and texture to the skin. As they grew closer, he saw their faces. They were horrific. No noses, no mouths, eyes dripping from a lack of eyelids. They were not human, but did they used to be? He could not spend more energy discerning or pondering their beginnings. Outnumbered, like always. 4 of them. The 3 running at him had closed half the distance already. He could not run that fast. The one whom stayed back by the hill's bottom seemed twice the size of the others. Without blade focus, he would not be facing it. Even back then he was the thinker, the strategist, the one who could sway the table. That part was him from the start, not given. Arthur was jealous of himself, of a man who didn't know. Time to prepare. 2 wielded axes, one a greatsword like himself, but black metal and seemingly 9 inches larger. They moved without finesse, more like rambling beasts. This was his indicant. They would use wild sweeping blows, all slashes, no lunges. They would attack together, but staggered from a lack of coordinated patterns. The fear was pushed down. He had his plan. Excitement in its place as he let only his own world matter, not what happened without him. Now at worst he would enter myth with a Valhalla-like end against true evil. Well, now his perspective allowed him to look back and know they were mostly victims. They had their own minds, but were birthed by and with ill intent, more instinct than minded, and were closer to doing evil rather than being it. The 3 thundered closer, now 75 meters away. Arthur's hand squeezed around the handle of his weapon tightly. He rose it above his head and held stance. The first abomination reached him about before the others, swinging its axe high and horizontal, trying to take his head. Arthur had already knowingly taken knee, the swing missing him. Then he rose spring-like, thrusting sword up.
It jutted up through the creature's neck and out the top of his head. He then jumped backwards, holding arms bent, retrieving his blade forward through the face. He had given it a mouth. The next blow had already been thrown, though it wasn't in Arthur's eyeline until after the corpse fell, an axe flying towards his face. He came across right to left with the blade. Whilst the momentum parried the axe away, it flung the knight off balance and onto the back foot. It mattered not. He was trained for such things. He used the momentum to drop his body downward as well as backward, shifting all his body weight. Though it felt like it ripped his calf and quad muscles, he flung himself forward, stabbing the second through the chest. The infernal creature grabbed the blade with both hands and cared not of the impalement. It looked into Arthur's eyes with hate. The silence is what stunned the warrior's reflexes, as none were quiet when killed, though he had never faced the mouthless. As the fiend held tight, it guaranteed the knight's steel remained within itself, and the final attacker reached the handicap battle with a simple plan. It lunged its greatsword without breaking pace, stabbing its own comrade in the back with enough power to pierce through its entire body and out its front. It carried on, piercing the front of Arthur's battered armour where its point tickled his rib. The man screamed in pain, and he felt the usual warm wetness. The final brute was stunned with his own success, but the pain had awoken the knight from his dazed concern. He had realised the two swords within meant the second creature was dead standing. It had released the base of his sword. Arthur jumped back then sideways, a well-versed sidestep, retrieving sword and facing the creatures. Third left holding up the second. Before it could pull its sword from the back of his companion, Arthur put his entirety into a roaring blow, taking off both heads in one straight-armed sweep, the living one but the dead as well. Arthur smiled from the recollection. If not his finest move, one of his favourites. Shame it never reached legendary status like a Yenya deed. The bloodied knight fell to knee and hand, barely able to keep his face from kissing dirt. He smiled broadly in celebration for a handful of heartbeats before a fear struck it from his face like a punch. Horrendous high-pitched laughter, taunting and screeching, like a bat-mated hyena, like knives were stabbing the air. The fourth, the giant. Why had it not attacked or approached? How had he forgotten? He raised his head and looked over towards it. It stood where it had. It was guarding the hill and nothing else mattered. It was far more heinous than its predecessors. The bellowing laughter came from its chest, a giant opening nipple to nipple. It opened large enough to eat a man whole, and had more teeth than a shark. The abyss within was totally black, no visible tongue, just darkness with a border of razors. As it met eyes with Arthur, the monster stopped laughing, bringing the mouth shut, closing its chest, but leaving the lipped opening, teeth smiling, a warning. It began to clap, huge webbed hands clawed and homunculus-like. Arthur knew his chances against this mouth-chest monster were depressing. Fear turned to terror. But he was not just a knight. He was Arthur Palegrey, the knight, the king's own and table sent, the only one left of the 33. He pushed, sitting up onto his shins, and took a slow, deep, frame-resetting breath. He began to remove armour, first helmet, then chest plate. It was too heavy, and in this tired state, the speed would be needed. It didn't want to fight him. It wanted to swallow him whole or bite his head off. It did not even have a weapon. This was a hunt. He got to his feet, checking his dagger was still in its hilt. The clapping stopped, but he would not gaze over. His ears would warn him. He carried on until all was removed except wrist guards for blocking. As he got to his feet, he did his best to push the fire down in his guts and picked up his sword. He stumbled towards the beast, dragging it one-handed, its point rustling grass, cutting floor. Everything too heavy. The situation too heavy. This was his death. 50 feet from reaching the beast, he stuck the blade in the ground. He would get it on the way back. The wishful thinking made him chuckle. The mountain guard made itself ready, a strange pose. He would bait it, but stay away, wait for it to try and devour him. It will use arm-assisted leaps with large snapping bites. This is when he would dodge, throw his knife, and run for the top, hoping. He stopped 10 paces from the beast, settled himself enough to enact his plan, but before he could finish approaching and engage, everything started to shake. Arthur had only heard of earthquakes, but somehow he knew this wasn't one. It sounded more like the earth was roaring than quaking. A surface origin. The wounded man looked to the top of the mountain, knowing time's sands were running. All the same, the creature demanded his attention. As it continued its shrieking laughter and began approaching him, Arthur scuttled back a good distance before forcing himself to stop and take low pose. The creature stopped at the knight's grounded sword.
It clumsily took the blade one-handed, then easily pulled it from the ground and held it above. Arthur didn't want to believe his eyes, but then with deep growls, not used to words, it spoke.
Here to eat, not eaten. Next, son.
The mouth closed tight, no smile. But before Arthur could think, let alone reply, the being plunged the sword down through its own head, all the way to the hilt. It fell dead. The man was flabbergasted. Head spinning, ground shaking, he broke out into a jog. Passing corpse, he was surprised how easy it was to remove sword. The creature was decaying unnaturally fast and already gooey. Was that where the luck ends, he thought? As he moved, his mind pounded as much as his body, right arm dead as he dragged sword upward and upward towards the top of the mound. Soon he could rest it. He spoke aloud to self-soothe as he neared the top. Better just be a fucking witch up here. He panted the words to himself. He pondered one last time before pulling himself up the final earth curl. So many beliefs had been shattered. He needed to be brash and knowing to be a knight. He never knew this pride was so mutable. He wasn't entirely the man he thought he was. Hoisting himself up, he took battle pose, but was shocked to find nothing but a very small old woman. Not your usual-looking witch. She was sitting in a giant pile of blood, making pictures with it and mumbling, though. There would be no guilt. He was actually happy at the seeming ease of the final task. However, as he approached her, another roar sounded, the loudest yet. It shook the floor, wobbling his footing. She didn't open her eyes, but stopped mumbling and moving. Look for yourself. I may hurt you, but I'm not the enemy. Her voice was raspy, but somehow sweet. Arthur thought it like honey oil. As she spoke, she gestured her hand behind her to the far-sided ledge. He approached but passed her, and looked over the ledge. Now he was fear-frozen. Petrified. He saw what could make enough sound to rumble the earth. He fell to his knees. Overside the ledge deep below, burrowed at the mountain's core, was what could only be described by Arthur as Hell's Gate. The old man chuckled at his past self. So naive, those thoughts of hell and its doors. He didn't have the words at the time to even verbalize. Forms that were cousin to fire swirled, crazy and curious lightning danced, and rocks tumbled. All of this and more tore open the earth, but deeper than stone. Somehow deeper than air. An entrance to another plane would be enough to stun a hero, but the real horror was what was trying to squeeze through, what would not fit. A creature Arthur could not describe, mainly as its body consisted of so much he had never seen, as well as move within and out of itself, ever changing its shape and number of appendages. The only thing more numerous were its varying mouths. Like a finger in a lake, it currently had what could only be described as its arms reaching through the tear. It rescinded itself but had far from given up. With the haste of a trapped submariner ditching gear for freedom as air was running out, it began ripping at itself, taking off parts of itself, rabidly and furiously cutting and biting, shearing off limbs and jutting outgrowths as well as the deep slabs of flesh they sat upon. Arthur wondered if it felt pain during this, as it was stringy and black under wound, but there was no bleeding. He was glad it had no eyes to see him watching. Then, as if it heard his mind, it stopped the struggle and made noise from its smallest mouth. This one different from the low-pitched ground mover, but instead so high-pitched it made the knight's ears hurt. He pulled his head away from the ledge, bare his ears bleed. Or his eyes. The noise ceased. "How in heaven am I supposed to fight that?" coughed out the man. He clambered to feet, leaving sword by ledge, and turned walking towards the witch. He now saw her eyes were open. One was red, the other blue. She spoke to him in a quick, pleading tone. "Who'd have guessed sister first? Lucky, really. She wants to eat the world, and only I can stop her. But I've not got enough left in me to summon the strength. I have just enough to shut the door. I need your strength, too. I know you're scared, but you're a knight. Be brave. I can't do it alone. Can't stay and go." She walked as she rambled, gently grabbing his arm whilst passing him. Arthur remained looking where she had stood, shell-shocked. He desperately reached for what to say, what to do beyond beg for instruction. He then felt sharp and unexpected pain in his right arm, both in memory and life. The present. Zaros was behind him, squeezing his arm stump. Arthur assumed he must have eavesdropped and got bored watching him daydream in silence. He hated the creep, for so many reasons. For one, he in both lives saved slaves, not owned slave armies. He should have reached the celestial room before drifting off. He was getting too old for all the espionage.
I didn't know you could be so sweet, One Arm."
The Pirate King mockingly crunched his face to accompany the words. He had spent too long in his past shoes. Remnants of the night remained. Arthur spun around to face the 7-foot man. Hooking his right foot around the back of Zaros's knee, he pulled in with his leg while striking the self-titled king in the lower chest with a straight strike with his left hand. Although the move was well executed, he was so weak and Zaros so large it did no more than stumble both men back. The pirate was outraged, and with one hand clutched Arthur by neck, lifted, then smashed him against the wall. Arthur knew it wasn't the rock wall. It didn't hurt enough. It was flat. It was glass. Water glass. The water prison. He didn't care that he could not breathe. He did not struggle.
You little shit. You can't win 'em all, old man. What's on offer in life is a couple of moments of victory floating on a sea of defeat. And that's the lucky ones. I've seen many fall before their time.
Zaros's threat started with frothing anger but ended flat. Arthur needed to breathe. He was back entirely. Nothing woke him like pain. He slipped his hand into his tunic, purposefully cutting it on the sharp middle button, then touched the now reddened finger across one of the sigils burned across his chest. Escape. Its name was apt. Zaros noticed, and his purple eyes widened, but Arthur wasn't pulling a gun. He had already fired, and the magic was instant. The large scarred hand was wrenched off him, all fingers bent, and the giant flew backwards in the air as if thrown, hitting the rock wall hard. A normal man would crack then slump. The king of pirates stayed on his feet. Instead of attacking with punch or enchanted trinket, he glanced at his contorted hand and spoke coldly, with a warrior's dominance.
Whatever you're planning, I can smell it. Cassie can smell it. If Yenya votes with us, you better give up the witch. We both know you and his plan ain't worth shit, and I don't care. Any funny business, I'll kill you myself. Fuck a kickback. Just know I'm watching.
The smile dancing with his words was ominous. With this, the Pirate King took a swig from a beautifully blue teardrop vial and his whole body darkened. He became translucent, then vanished as if he was an ugly gas. Arthur knew he was invisible, still there. Would he hit him? He used his left hand to wipe his brow and turned around. He had changed his mind. No longer would he go through the celestial door, but instead the portal back to the Blood Tower. He felt danger was coming earlier than everyone had planned. Better try sleep while he can. Chapter 4. Hide your headaches. Now deep into the water hall, Sophia could tell the group had not noticed her. In their defense, the room was huge, heavily ordained with magical memorabilia, and she rarely entered a room quietly. The girl was still stumbling slowly, unable to refresh her gait. There was just so much to consider. Her mental monologue fast, unlike her steps. To any of you still here, thank you for listening. You can grab a full copy of the audiobook from the links below. And as an extra push, I'll tell you that my favourite character, Quirf the Pleasure Gremlin, isn't even in this sample. Anyway, even if not, all comments are appreciated. If you hit that subscribe button, that's really appreciated. Anyway, until next time.
Peace.